Many of you know him. He's in the course of my windy intro, he's already forgotten more about the agency world than I already know. But in addition to having covered ad agencies for decades and this industry, Joe's recently taken up a passion for unraveling the complexity of data-driven and real-time processes and the ways in which they affect the entire marketing world. Ken mentioned earlier that we just last week launched the new real-time media and marketing daily. Joe is heading that effort, writing stories around it, driving a lot of the aggregation around it. Part of the aim of this new newsletter is to look at how real-time and how data really is affecting all aspects of the media buying and planning community. Please welcome Joe Mandisi.
Thank you, Steve. I'm sorry, I just want to press click, upload. That was my 3,655th piece of personal data I've uploaded this week. So let me start by introducing the panel, and then I'll explain the objective here. So let me get this right. So we have, from my left, we have Judy Lotion, who is the Vice President of Digital Analytics for Epsilon. And then we have Jennifer Loom, who is co-founder and president of Adelphic Media. Then we have Mark Miller, who's Senior Vice President, CRM Practice Lead at Digitas. Then we have our old friend Dave Morgan, who's CEO of Simul Media. And then we have Vikram Samaya, who is General Manager of WeatherFX, the weather company, division of the weather company. So actually, I kind of want to warm things up because I know we're all chilly here. So I want to start by discussing a principle of thermodynamics. Specifically, one called entropy. And I'm not a science geek, but according to Wikipedia, entropy is a measure of how easily energy is distributed in a system. And in a physical system, entropy provides a measure of the amount of energy that can be put to work. The reason I'm citing entropy and the second law of thermodynamics is I kind of think there's an analogy here with what's going on with big data and the application of information and insights. So about a year ago, Facebook came out with a statistic that said in 2003 there was 1 petabyte of new information being created by the internet that year, and that now it estimates there's about 1 petabyte of new data being created by the internet every 2 days. So that's a lot of data. So my goal with this panel is to really talk about how we integrate these digital streams of data that are becoming plentiful. We're going to talk about mobile as well. But every single device basically is going to be throwing off data, and we're going to only have more and more of it. And how do we integrate that with the other part of the data we have, the real world, or the physical world at least? And that's one reason why I wanted WeatherFX here in particular, because they deal with the most real world you can imagine, our physical environment, and how that influences consumer and brand and marketing decisions. So on the panel, we have some agency representatives. We have a mobile representative. We have Dave Morgan, who maybe it's all his fault why we're even here today, because he's one of the guys who invented, data targeting in online media. And I'd just kind of like to throw off an opening question to the panel about whether you think, this could be a bad thing, that we actually have too much information, or to coin a paraphrase what Rashad Tabakawala once said at one of our conferences, data, data everywhere, and not a drop to think. So do you think we're actually reaching a point of getting loaded with information, and to the subject of this panel, how do we right-size it?
I'll jump in. I don't think so. I mean, I think there are people that are overloaded with data, but I don't think people who know where they're going and have a specific purpose in mind and a point of view have an overload problem. I mean, they now have an advantage. I think that people that want to be multi-purpose, totally flexible, and sort of follow others are finding themselves overloaded because they don't know what it is they're looking for, and in most cases, they were doing a terrible job with little data. So the idea that they're going to do a better job with big data, doesn't follow.
I mean, there's a saying that think about things not as they are, but as they could be. And I think big data really allows you to aspire to things that you don't necessarily see. Who's read the book, just came out, The Human Face of Big Data by Rick Smolan? A brilliant book. The point is, it's less about thinking about the data and how to use the data. It's about first defining the problem and then going to the data. And I think that book clearly articulates all that can be. I mean, it's analogous to a puzzle. You know, just imagine a table with thousands of pieces of a puzzle, different shapes, sizes, colors. Initially, you have no idea where to begin. It's overwhelming. But you get people at the table, and eventually you're going to start to see what pieces fit together, what pieces don't fit together, how like colors fit together, and eventually you start to see patterns and get the context, and that's the value of the big data. And I see it as more of an enabler than a detractor.
Okay, so let's follow up on that point. I think what I was really trying to get at is what you're talking about there is relevance, is how to find the right signals that you can apply to your consumer or marketing or media strategy. So my concern is that we're getting so much new sources of data that it starts to overwhelm and crowd out the right signals. How do we know what we're playing? Just because you can find out that people like you on Facebook, is that the right metric for you to be applying versus some harder to get data that might be locked in Axiom's database somewhere or something like that?
So what I think around that is, yes, not every data, not every piece of data, not every form of data is going to work. And in fact, if you want to add something to that, not all data will work at all times, and not all data will work on the same person. So what we have to do a lot of is testing, is optimizing, and I think that new breed of sort of data naut that we talked about, so the people who are working through data as sort of as a large continuum where you have lots of different possible signals that could be useful, you have to be comfortable with sort of discomfort, right? And I think that's kind of the key piece that people who are working with this are beginning to find out, that data is often wrong, it's often dirty, it's hard to work with, and that is, you need to be fundamentally comfortable with that fact. And then build that into easy-to-use executable tests. And if you find something that works, do it again and again. You know? So I think those simple pieces, if you follow them, make something that's very complicated usable, which is the key here.
And I think, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that we do when we have clients who come to us and say, what do I do with all of this data, is sit down and do a data assessment. And the first thing we do in that data assessment is specifically state objectives and goals of why we're pulling this data together. I think one of the most unique exercises that we do go through is pulling in samples of data. So starting small with samples of data, and based on their objective, if that is to target people who are ready to purchase or convert, to really push them over the conversion hump, we take the data and understand how each of those different data sources, whether it's social or web data or email data, understand how those data points actually correlate with the purchase within their consumer database, so that they can understand, at least at a first pass, which data is most indicative of the action that they're interested in. That can help them start to focus on the data source that they want to use or should be using for their targeting of messaging.
So you have to kind of play and experiment with the data to find out which ones are generating the right signals.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that a requirement that's becoming more and more important in data systems for decisioning in marketing and advertising, these systems need to be more flexible, right? They can no longer be configured or programmed in a way that decisions are being made the same way every single time. That's something that our company is working on bringing to the mobile space, where we're making decisions based on all of the data available to us in real time for each unique user.
I mean, one of the things that excites me about what you're doing and what happened with the online display advertising marketplace was it's a great example of where if you can't see it, if the data doesn't exist, the medium in effect doesn't exist. And the whole reason I get excited with what's going on with online display, programmatic trading, and all this really geeky stuff is that people have figured out how they could harness the data to understand where consumers are doing things, behaving, and where they might be receptive to an ad, and that's created a whole market structure. And I think what Jennifer and her partner are trying to do is, and others obviously in that space too, are trying to crack the same code for mobile. And would it be fair to say, and you can all weigh in on this, that the reason mobile's been a non-starter so far as an advertising medium is that you don't have access to that data yet?
I mean, I don't think that's the only reason. I think creative is the other big problem there, right? I mean, mobile is such a specific experience. It's so intimate that when you're playing with it, the current creative formats are problematic. I mean, and that's one of those situations where you can pour all the data you want at it, but that's not necessarily going to fix it with the other side of the coin having not been solved. So I would say I mean, there are two fundamental problems there, but the carriers have also held a lot of control over mobile. And perhaps that's what you were referencing.
Yeah, the creative messaging is an important discussion, but it's another panel discussion, really. But what we're talking about here is how do you reach a consumer that's predisposed for a brand message. You can figure out what message to put in there. But what I'm saying is that I think that what's really exciting to me in terms of the application of big data in terms of media targeting is that it's unlocking audiences. I mean, Dave, you're doing the same thing really with simul media when you come right down to it, is that you're using remnant data or exhaust data that other people were never looking at to target television.
Yeah, I think the issue that at the end of your question is that most of marketing, I mean, almost all of marketing, except for a lot of like very intense direct marketing, has been a world of using proxies or past practices and repeating them and doing what you do because you did something yesterday or doing something because your competitors or your colleagues are doing something. And unfortunately, that's built a type of person, a type of practice. I mean, best practices. I mean, I'm tired of people getting up and saying, I do it because it's best practices. I mean, that's bullshit, I think. I mean, you should do it because it's the best thing to get the result, not because I'm not going to get fired because 10 other people do it, and we talk about it at conferences, and we've called it a best practice. And not to say that there aren't ways you can improve your organization. And so I think one of the challenges we have is that now when we have all of this data, the overwhelming issue is that when you have a lot of people, processes, organizations that have been driving their businesses out of the rearview mirror or with what's happening next to them, it's a very different kind of world to think about. What does it mean to look forward out the front, take a big risk, not just report on what happened, take a risk. And so it's a different kind of person. And your indicators, you don't have the set of normal indicators. That's why I think like the book and movie Moneyball was great, because they came at it from a very different view and they had an organization willing to do it. And all of the scouts and the other teams, other than Billy Bean and the A's, didn't understand what they were doing because what they were doing was very counter. So they really focused on the counterintuitive and the non-intuitive results. And those became the things that they separated the wheat from the chaff and went for those.
I might also say that data sometimes contributes to that problem, right? When you actually have analytics that are only looking at what you used to do, and it said, well, these things worked, and you're not looking at what you can do to influence or change behavior, often you can lean back on that and say, well, the data said that. It's almost the same thing that Dave just mentioned, right? That's what used to happen, and the data says it, so we're good to go. And you're not actually building sort of proactive applications of that data to disrupt previous patterns and see what will happen differently if I try something different. And that's what I think needs to happen sort of more and more often as people start really taking control of the data and using it actively rather than passively.
Okay, and a lot of this always starts with what's your goal and what do you want to achieve so that you even know what the right data to look at is. And one of my concerns is that because the data is becoming so plentiful, and it's so abundant, in the case of that Facebook stat, it's a lot of tweets and status updates and, that kind of stuff. Is it really a meaningful signal? Whereas your data, I mean, if we had known it was going to be this cold in the room, we would have ordered more hot coffee, So I think real world data is getting crowded out, and I'm kind of curious what all of you think because you're all dealing in both worlds.
Well, let me talk examples. Sorry, I'm being attacked by the wire. The problem that most brands have is being relevant, and being relevant requires engaging with customers on their terms in the moment. And there are many tools out there that allow brands to listen to conversations and the content that is being shared. The question is, how do brand teams work differently knowing that you have all these tools available? And many agencies, ours include, leverage tools like Topsy and Brandwatch and Skywords to really monitor a lot of the trending content, but to use that content to help publish information that's relevant to the brand, but also relevant to the customer. You can think about traditional retail, QSR, you know, the McDonald's and Burger Kings of the world. Typically, when they develop loyalty programs, points-based loyalty programs, it's all about frequency, share of wallet. Well, wouldn't it be good to really understand which of perhaps McDonald's customers are also engaging in other QSR loyalty programs? How do you do that? Because that information isn't in the marketing database. You do it by linking it to a lot of the publicly available social data. You start to get patterns around, you know, share of wallets. So it's a traditional problem, but it's using different data sets. And rather than getting lost in all the data sets, focus on the data that addresses the problem. You know, other examples, healthcare in particular, if you look to Boston and Partners Healthcare, Mass General, Children's Health, what they're trying to do is they're trying to keep their patients out of the hospital. What are they doing? They're doing in-home diagnostics, remote monitoring, virtual coaching, tremendous amount of data that is being generated. But at the end of the day, it's about improving a person's health and keeping them out of the hospital. Practical need. You know what data to use, whether it's electronic health records, insurance data. You'll be able to get very specific in where to focus.
Bringing another example of, I guess, bringing the data sources together and the importance of that is we were working with a CPG company, and we were specifically focused on their email marketing program and measuring the value of that program. And to date, the only way they measured the value of that program was through click-through rates and how that compared to benchmarks. And that's all they had. We actually was able to work with a grocery store chain that had the ability to give us their loyalty data so that we could merge that grocery store purchase data into the email marketing list. And we were able to hold out a group from their email marketing program that did not receive email messaging anymore to help them quantify the actual value of their email marketing program. And at the end of the day, they were able to say, my customers in the email marketing program, when they were touched with an email, they were actually purchasing 20% more in ounces. They measured it in ounces because it's CPG, but they were able to quantify the actual increase in ounces consumed by their email marketing customers just through bringing those sources of data together. So I think it's, you know, it's really key to be able to facilitate the merging of that online and offline data to answer questions like that.
Well, that's a great example. And it makes me wonder, and even before there was digital data streams with click-throughs, you know, our industry used a lot of other surrogate measures like, you know, CPMs and GRPs. And I just wonder if sometimes we're just not lazy and that we don't want to dig deeper to find out what the behavior or the action was. Because in the end, all you really want is a conversion or a happy customer or brand lift. But we always reduce it to these simple metrics. Dave?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. I mean, the one thing that has surprised me with the work I'm doing now, we're focusing not in online now, where it was targeting in a lot more direct marketing, but more mass awareness advertisers on TV. And it's not, wouldn't be a surprise because that's sort of what you'd expect. I mean, the focus on trying to keep it on old metrics and what has been done and not changing it. And the one thing that really surprised me was how much that goes all the way to the client and to the top at the client level. That part, you know, I kept assuming, well, it's the media sellers that bundled in ways that people don't want it. It's the agencies that are lazy that don't want to work harder. But, you know, I've talked to CMOs of several large studios on theatrical releases and said, why aren't you tying your television advertising to box office results? Because when you buy $45 million of TV for 3 weeks, it's very easy to develop not just correlation, but strong causation between those individual spots when you look at set-top box data and movie going at that screen. And I got the same response, which was, that's not my job. My job is a Thursday night tracking number against a panel which is based on several decades old approaches, because the last thing you want to do if you're the marketing director of a large studio is have Monday morning come around and try to claim credit for a hit, because then you are going to take the fall for a movie that goes down, and if you're opening 14 movies or 20 movies a year, you're going to have a bunch of bombs, and you want to avoid having to take credit for the bombs. And I find that in packaged goods. I find that in the marketers of a lot of other places, which is ultimately if they make it too accountable and really take ownership and take risk and own part of the P&L, it's a skill set they're actually not very comfortable with, and they're probably going to lose their jobs because of it and be replaced by someone who is one of these infonaut type people.
I mean, one of the things that I've felt actually in my time at the Weather Company, which is an umbrella brand that includes the Weather Channel among others, is actually how quickly marketers have jumped onto what we're doing at WeatherFX. And this is kind of the obligatory plug, but it also speaks to what we've been doing. So we've been combining hyperlocal information with weather condition information, combining that with both consumer sentiment and actual weather conditions, historically, real time, and into forecast. And then we've been translating it into programs for marketers, right? Within insurance, within retail. And actually, they have jumped on it with both feet. Almost to the point where we're like, whoa, 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 slow down, right? So, and that's a welcome relief when you work in data. Sometimes, data scarcity is actually an issue we work with a lot in audience targeting. And the cool thing about weather is it always exists for any hyperlocal region you're in, and we have it. And so that makes it very easy for us. It also makes it sort of privacy friendly, which is, again, an unusual thing in our business sometimes. But the one thing, again, to reiterate my point, I think what I have seen is when you have an idea that has sort of universal resonance like this, right, marketers are pretty quick to move, right? And it becomes interesting to see what are the vested interests around making those kinds of changes and what's pushing back against it. And sometimes it's not just that the data, I mean, sometimes it's as simple as if we think the data is probably going to work, then show us it does, and if it does, then we'll spend more money with you. And then do it again.
So both of you made a really important point that I think we need to address, which is about being human and being people, right? Dave, you pointed about the culture and the organizations that are used to buying this way because of accountability. And Vikram, you made a point about data we can all relate to, which is weather. I mean, one of the reasons I think marketers and customers can relate to it is we all understand and can get the weather. But I don't think a lot of us can get cookies and other kinds of surrogate measures. They're really important signals in the right context. My question is one of the big issues here that we don't understand how to humanize the data and make it accessible for people to think about? All right, let me give you an example. This week I interviewed the CEO of Rocket Fuel, which is a company that helps real-time media traders optimize how they're buying real-time media based on the data flow. And they're named that way because they use rocket science to do it. And I asked them what their big achievement was in the last year, and they said, well, the big achievement was we were able to get the human process out entirely, right? So for the past year, up until that point, they were letting the machines run, using AI and machine learning to have outcomes, and they'd have human beings go in and look at them every 2 or 3 days to make sure they were delivering the right outcomes. Well, they were able to program machines to check on the machines to make sure they were having the right outcomes. So I love that point because it kind of indicates a little bit of where we're going. But then the most important insight I heard today was the lady from Macy's this morning who said, you can get too perfect. You can get too relevant where you become like transparent to the consumer. You could become, that's an amazing insight. So my concern is, don't we need to really think like humans in the end and not like big data machines?
I think it's less a function of the data. I just think it's more a function of how people plan and think about marketing. Invariably, we think of customers in terms of how much value they bring to the brand rather than how much value the brand brings to the customer. And that's the value of this data set that is out there, really gaining a context on individuals and all of the information they use to make their decisions and where the brand fits in. It's not about the data. It's just about how you market. Again, getting to, retail, especially clothing stores, RFM, value-based modeling. The next step is obviously going to be attitudinal needs-based segmentation that you can probably, you can type people based on questions that they answer when they register But there's also a lot of this social behavioral data that provides you a context that you never had before. Companies like TrueLens allow you to take the social behavioral data and append it to your marketing database. It allows you to create very, very different type of programs, key opinion leader programs, new types of segmentation models, new content, new messaging. And again, it's just about rethinking the data in the context of what the hell do customers want, and not about how do I make all this money for the brand.
Yep. And I think to extend that, but on the human issue, when you're looking at the market, I think, a piece I saw that was really interesting a few weeks ago, I think you all probably reported on too. Brian Weiser of Pivotal Research and used to be with Magna wrote a
Simul
piece.
Media too.
And we worked together at Simul Media as well. He wrote a piece about his projections for this next year, and he really looked at breaking marketing, the advertising, not just the marketing, the advertising spend into two buckets: the ROI spend, where any increase or decrease was going to be basically based on results, and then that which was entirely ROI independent, but was driven by macroeconomic factors and industrial production in the U.S., for example. And he looked at a lot of TV spend, and so he looked at categories and said, the amount the insurance companies are spending is not tied to how much the phone rings at the agent in aggregate. It's really about, once Geico broke it open and started spending, they all needed to spend, or you lost share of voice and you lost. And that's the hard thing, which is you can't necessarily get an ROI on the back end, but like if you're McDonald's and you take your TV spend down by 20% in any given month, you're going to have insurrection on your hands from your franchisors, because they're going to be losing business to somebody else. And this is where, I think the point you made was these models have to be very complex and look at a lot of all the alternatives and all the forward different things and dynamics that are more than simply just, I spent this and I got this bit of feedback just down this channel. It's much larger and more complex. And a lot of it's very human in its sort of scenario planning.
Another great human insight from you, Dave. But let me ask you, don't we all think that the tide is moving more towards performance-based, short-term, conversion-type data application, and less toward those longer-term brand building and competitive-type strategies you're referring to?
Yeah, there's not a question, but I think it's probably because of some other factors. I think that most of the folks in the marketing departments for the large mass awareness advertisers today are not capable of pushing back. They're no longer a member of the C-suite. In most cases, they're 2 hops away from the CEO. Their direct report is typically underneath the CFO or close to the CFO. Procurement owns their business. They have a really difficult time pushing back because they aren't really skilled and equipped to make the argument for the ROI out of their TV budget. And so they're trying to do more with less, and they're finding they can keep their job better if they squeeze their agency, reduce the fee, keep doing as much as they can do, and spread some money out. And I don't think we've seen the mass awareness long-term brand building people understand analytics enough and data enough to build models to go back to their bosses and say, it's like the Erwin Gottlieb line, which is, if the first time you see a Mercedes ad is when you're in market for a luxury car, Mercedes failed. That would have had to been done years and years in advance, and maybe a decade or 2 in advance, for you to be inclined for that purchase. And I think that it's easy to sort of look at this happened, this signal, this action in 24 or 48 hours. It's very difficult to do it over years, and that takes a real point of view and passion and understanding, which we don't see from the people making the spend.
If you have any questions, just raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. But I want to ask Jennifer about the challenge with mobile. What is the big data issue with getting mobile to work as a marketing platform? Because I think everybody would like to do that.
Sure. So I think there's a lot of data that's beginning to show that mobile is becoming the most effective marketing platform across digital. I think mobile is perfectly designed to be to be able to drive and deliver immediate direct response. I think the biggest challenge with mobile right now is in bringing both marketers, publishers, other members of the ecosystem forward to focus in on newer data points that are much more influential in driving consumer behavior response. So there's still a lot of value to be leveraged from more traditional data sources and offline data sources, but with the real-time nature of mobile, data, for example, that can be provided by the weather companies, such as real-time location and weather information, these are the newer types of data that are actually driving consumer response. So there's a sort of a mind shift that is required. But there's also, I think, in parallel, a lot of work being done to be able to tie everything that we're learning about mobile consumer behavior and building profiles and segments to all of the established databases, profiles, and IDs that have been invested in and built in over the past decade.
I mean, in a way, it's kind of exponential because you have so many different signals, the physical device, the carrier, all these different things that all send some meaning about what the consumer's doing. We had a story yesterday about admarketplace.com had launched a targeting platform that can now target ads, search-based text ads, to a user based on what device they're holding. So it differentiates if it's a Samsung 3 or a BlackBerry whatever or iPhone 5. That sets a whole nother consideration set in place. Not just what their user experience is on the size of that screen, but what the demographic composition is of people who buy those devices, what their emotional sentiment might be. I mean, where do you stop?
Sure. So we actually have a very different point of view on mobile, where up until now, mobile advertising has been very much focused around targeting devices or targeting carriers. And reality is that marketers care about consumers, they care about real people, right? So we want to bring that aspect to the market, where we're not just trying to present, identify, and sell you iPhone 5s or a Nexus, right? I think that is one data input that can provide a lot of relevance to a specific offer. And it's something that's great, that's been introduced through mobile, but we certainly don't believe that should be an anchor in mobile targeting.
And just to build on Jennifer's argument there, we think data needs to be to be native to the whole company, right? So we obviously have a TV division. We do a lot of work on digital, both online and mobile. And our intent with building out WeatherFX as kind of a data hub was that all of these pieces need to start thinking about this stuff as native. Right? Data shouldn't be a new siloed element that sits outside these pieces, but when you're building product, we're building product for localized targeting on TV, we're pushing to local markets, data needs to be part of that. When you're pushing to online and beginning to understand what the consumer models of engagement are, whether you're in lean back mode or whether you're intimate with your phone or what that looks like, data needs to be native to that. The thinking has to be native. And, the clearest examples I got of this are when I watched my 4-year-old, play with his iPad, right? He's already better at Temple Run than I am in like 10 seconds. It's that sort of built into the bone nativity with data that we want to train and encourage. I think that's what needs to happen for any of this other stuff to work. Certainly on the marketer side, they're feeling the same pain we are. It's that transition that's going to be difficult. And as we manage that together with more channels, with more data to play with, that's just a lot of inputs. And it can be too much for certain people, and certain companies should fail. Right? I mean, without failure, you're not going to have success. And so I'm not going to tell you everything that makes our models great. Why would I? It seems silly.
Question over here, if we could get a microphone to this gentleman.
Hi there, Mark. You mentioned there was a shift towards immediate short-term ROI and just return on at the ad spend. But how do we convince the organization or the clients to look at the long-term, bigger picture? Because in the face of data, it's very difficult to argue against, well, this campaign has an immediate ROI that I can prove, while this longer-term campaign is more ambiguous. What is your suggestion and approach there?
Was that question for me?
Well, you kind of described the situation about the drive to short-term ROI.
Yeah, I mean, most of our brands, I mean, it is going to be about driving incremental revenue, and very often the ROI is long-term, especially in the insurance space when you have to enroll accounts and then policyholders at 6 months to 12 months to get full ROI. So with most of our clients, I mean, it's the in-process metrics, it's the end-process metrics, and it's taking a holistic view. Again, the insurance client in particular, they have a Holland Partners brand health tracker, they do tracking with Nielsen, they have a media mix, marketing mix analysis that does the tracking, there's digital analysis that is done, and it can get very overwhelming. And essentially what you want to do is you want to come up with a single page that measures on KPIs and benchmarks at every stage of the buying cycle for each segment, and every week you're looking at how these metrics move. Some of them move, others don't. Unaided awareness, you know. You definitely don't want to look at month-over-month movement, maybe a 13-week rolling average, but in terms of sentiment analysis, quality of leads, those are all proxies for what ROI could be. So again, KPIs, benchmarks, bringing all the different measurement studies together, knowing what to focus on because it's those variables that move, but also understanding the relationship between the in-process metrics and the end result. So there's a lot of analysis that has to be done. Does that answer your question? No.
Ad for the first time, then Mercedes has failed. But that clearly has to drive from a much foresight about, I need to have a campaign right now that's going to have ROI in the future that may not be immediately measurable.
Yeah, well, I'll jump on that. I think that, and this may also get to the human question that Joe talked about earlier. Those that are going to be most successful at this are going to be able to blend together both the science and math with art and persuasion. And I think that, you know, we're going to see our most successful folks are going to be able to have a point of view, arm themselves with the right data and build the surrogates to make the story. But, you know, I think the part of someone, if it's a question of convincing a client, I mean, it's gonna be a question of persuasion and having a point of view and being able to establish that this is this long-term objective we have. If you only want to be in business and if you're only churning what you can best churn right now, you're in harvest mode and just look at the most short-term things. But if you're going to be long-term, we're going to build long-term models, and some of those things are going to have to be taken on faith, or the best things we can get in surrogates. And I think it's interesting, if you look at the companies that have been some of the strongest long-term, the longest brand advertisers have been ones with very strong CEOs who in many times personally owned a lot of the marketing because they knew that was their business long term. And, you know, Steve Jobs and Apple is a great example. Put more money into TV, more money into outdoor, more money into magazine, much more than anybody else in the industry, which is why I think some of the best practices numbers don't make much sense, because the real people that are successful don't. But you have to sort of sell into the belief. And it also means that you can't sell that into some clients that are just not going to be structured to believe that way. It's not part of their business objective, and they don't care.
So we should ignore the data?
Oh. No, you have to, you're going to have to, you know, part of it is using the data, and part of it is how you deliver it and how you persuade folks with it.
Just a quick example, I think, to speak to your question of short-term versus long-term ROI on a campaign. I was working with a retailer, and their executive team absolutely loved the email channel to drive revenue today. So if their numbers were short for the week, they would send out an additional email to their consumer list because they knew at the end of the day they would have more revenue. And we set up a test with them, a frequency or a cadence test, to help their email marketing team prove back to the executive team why just triggering an email because they were short on revenue today wasn't a good thing. And for the first 2 weeks, it was the highest frequency looked really good in terms of revenue. Over the length of the test, the actual email list itself, because of the attrition rate on the higher frequency group, it was so high compared to the lower frequency group. At the end of the day, in the long term, they were actually losing quality customers on their email list because they were making these daily decisions to increase the frequency and drive revenue. So it's a delicate balance between what the short-term ROI is and the long-term ROI, I think, for marketers.
Another question here.
Yes, one quick question. I'm at Rocket Interactive. We're a very heavily digital, heavily data-driven agency. One of the problems we find from a mobile instance is with Safari blocking our cookies. So from a third-party standpoint, we're losing a lot of data, possibly up to 40, 50% of that data. This is kind of more directed at Jennifer. Where do we go from here? I mean, we're trying to utilize the data we have to make appropriate actions afterward, but understanding that there's a huge loss of data here that it's very disconcerting.
Right. So that's absolutely one of the biggest challenges in mobile right now, that all of the great cookie technology and data cannot really be leveraged in mobile. And so I think as a first step, something that you might want to consider is finding a good technology partner who can work with you in mobile with their own proprietary user identification technology to help you implement good tracking mechanisms. So we, for example, we offer our own tracking technology that works effectively both in the mobile web browser and in mobile apps.
Well, if I could ask one last quick rapid-fire question of the panel, I just want to get some kind of consensus on the basic thesis here of digital versus the rest of the world. So, you know, machines are really good at processing data that humans tell them to process. Humans are really good at looking at, understanding data they can see. We clearly have more and more digital streams of data coming. I would like you each to answer this question on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being that we don't have enough digital data, 5 being we have way too much. Tell me what your number is right now. In your mix.
I get to start?
Yeah.
You said 5, we have too much.
Way too much digital relative to looking at.
I have an answer, but
yeah.
there's a but after that
okay.
answer. Answer is 4. I think it depends on how we're using it. So there's a lot of digital data out there. It's not too much if you know how to use it correctly. But if you don't know how to use it correctly,
okay.
It's too much.
Fair.
Yeah, so we'll take more. We'll take more data.
You're a 5.
But I think, what is important, what we're focusing on is finding the right linkage points between all of these sources to make it useful and actionable to our partners.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you're a 1.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm a 1 as well, but because I'm a digital agency and I'm biased. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's just a digital issue. It's operations, it's customer service, it's call center. I mean, the volumes of data on that side of the business that's so critical to dealing with issues like retention has to be considered.
1.
The largest supercomputing clusters in the world are trying to figure out what impact a butterfly's wings have on weather in Austin, right? It's not about how much data you have, it's how you simplify and utilize it. So 1, it should always be 1.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We'll come back and we'll do the numbers next year.